Safer Chemicals Podcast. Sound science on harmful chemicals. Welcome to the Safer Chemicals Podcast. In 2015, ECHA and the European authorities assessed the health risks of chemicals in tattoo inks and permanent makeup. They looked at whether their use needs to be restricted in the EU. They also checked whether potentially harmful chemicals could be replaced with safer alternatives and what impact restricting their use might have on the manufacturing industry and on service sector jobs. As a result of their assessment, the use of over 4,000 hazardous chemicals will be limited. The EU has also banned the use of specific blue and green pigments used in tattoo inks. For these, the ban will apply in the beginning of 2023 to allow industry more time to find safer alternatives. In this episode, you will be hearing from a toxicologist, dermatologist, and a tattoo artist who talk about the negative health effects from harmful chemicals used in inks and how restricting them impacts the tattooing industry. Let's start with Sebar Khalaf. She's a toxicologist and was part of the team that started the restriction together with other EU member states. Sebar, welcome. Let's dive straight in. Can you tell us what this new restriction is banning and why?
The purpose of the restriction is to protect consumers who want to get a tattoo or a permanent makeup from health risks from problematic substances. The new rules will be enforced from the 4th of January 2022. And for two specific pigments, a blue and a green one, the rules will be enforced a year later. The restriction is banning more than 4,000 chemical substances in inks for tattoos and permanent makeup. The restriction will protect consumers from substances that are carcinogenic, mutagenic, but also substances that are toxic for the reproduction, skin sensitizers, or damaging for the eye. Many of the substances is already forbidden or restricted in other products such as toys, textiles, but also cosmetics products.
Can you talk a little bit about which countries were involved in this assessment?
This is including Norway, Germany, but also Denmark, and the European Chemical Agency ECHA was involved in the assessment of the substances and the restriction.
Okay, and when does this restriction then enter into force?
The rules will be enforced from the 4th of January 2022, and for two pigments a year later in 2023.
Maybe then going really in depth under the skin, if you wish, on what we're going to be talking about. So how could these chemicals be dangerous, particularly in tattoo inks?
In the tattooing process, the ink is placed under the skin, and in this process, solid pigment particles are stored in the skin, while soluble particles are transported around the body. Over time, the soluble pigments will degrade due to exposure of sunlight or the body's own defense mechanisms, and this can release and exposure the chemicals that can cause, for example, gene mutations over time.
Gene mutations, that's a scary concept. Can you explain a little bit what kind of gene mutations?
Gene mutations are basically permanent changes in the genes, and they can be inherited in generations. Such mutations can cause genetic damage, and in some cases it can actually lead to the development of cancer also.
What about in terms of then the scale of this? So what kind of numbers are we talking about? How popular are tattoos in Europe?
Tattoos have actually been more and more popular over the years, and the number of people in the EU who has a tattoo is increased over the last few decades. Almost 15% of the population in the EU have at least one tattoo or a permanent makeup tattoo.
Wow, that's quite a big percentage. I mean, what about then people who've actually already taken a tattoo, possibly with these inks? Should they be worried?
That's actually a quite difficult question because both the creation and the removal of tattoo is linked to adverse health effects. And when a tattoo is removed, it's typically done by laser or light. And in this case, substances will be break down to smaller molecules, and the smaller molecules are probably more likely to be absorbed faster in the body and also transport around the body. So it could be quite problematic to remove the tattoo also.
Again, I'm conscious that we're talking very much about tattoos specifically, but everything you're saying, I assume, also applies to permanent makeup, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Maybe then, as a last question, what kind of advice would you give to people actually thinking of getting a tattoo? How can they stay safe? How can they protect themselves? What should they do before walking into that tattoo parlor and choosing to put something under their skin?
If you want to get a tattoo or a permanent makeup, you should always choose a professional artist and ask if he or she has completed a hygiene course. If you are ill or suffering of a chronic illness, such as diabetes, or have a weakened immune system, you should consult your doctor before you are getting the tattoo. Also, if you are pregnant, planning to be pregnant, or breastfeeding, you should be extra careful. And lastly, if you already have a tattoo and experience any discomfort, such as itching or swelling, you should consult your doctor.
That's really good advice that I'm sure our listeners will find useful. Thank you for joining us, Sebar. Next, let's look at what effects these inks can have on our skin. We met Nicola Kluger, who works at Helsinki University Hospital as an adjunct professor in dermatology and venereology. Nicola has many years of experience working with patients who have had allergic skin reactions caused by tattoo inks. Here is Päivi with the interview.
Thanks for joining us, Nicola. Perhaps we could start by discussing how does getting a tattoo or permanent makeup affect the skin?
Well, of course, it's not natural to get a tattoo. Our skin is not made for that, but we know for centuries that you can get tattooed. We have the experience of all the civilizations, but it's true that our skin reacts. It reacts first immediately when we get tattooed. When you introduce the pigment, everyone who has got a tattoo knows it's painful, the skin gets inflamed, it's bleeding a bit, and the skin will heal for the next weeks. Usually it's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 1 month, big maximum. Also, a part of the pigment which is too superficial in the epidermis will be peeled away during the healing phases. When the tattoo has healed, it looks that it's, I would say, inert or quiescent. It is mostly true, but there are little things happening in the skin. We know that we have macrophages, for instance, which are these cells which are going to try to eat the pigment, that are going to do a bit of work, even though it is not noticeable. Also, the tattoo will always fade a bit. The drawings will be a bit more blurry. So this is how it affects basically the skin in general.
So you said that there is this initial reaction a couple of weeks, but are there any long-term effects that we should be aware of in addition to this aging?
What we know, of course, is that a part of the pigment will migrate. It will migrate in the lymph nodes. So if you have a tattoo on the arm, the pigment will go into the lymph node. In most of the case, it's totally asymptomatic, and there is no proof that there is any desmol on the local lymph node. Of course, if for some medical reason the lymph node has to be removed, it can be black, a bit darker, or the pathologist will say that he sees pigments, but they have not really, I would say, a side effect as such. Then the big question is, of course, if it goes to the lymph node, does it go elsewhere? That's a theoretical concern. It is possible, especially when the particles are very small, like the nanoparticles. In terms of clinical consequences, we have no proof yet that this would have an effect on the health of the tattooed individual.
What is it then that causes this reaction on skin?
If we talk about just the tattoo as such, the fact that you have been getting a tattoo and you have thousands of impact of a needle on the skin, the body will react against the pigment. Then the second question is people who have side effects, why do they react? And that's another problem because we are not totally sure what is the cause. But as every allergic reaction that we have, like people are allergic to peanuts or allergic to birch, there are some people who are most likely predisposed themselves to get a reaction to a component which is in the tattooing.
Okay. Then about severe skin reactions after tattoos, how often does that happen? Do you have any statistics?
From the studies, basically what regards tattoo allergy, it could be between 1 to 8%, very broadly speaking, because it really depends on the studies, it really depends on the setting, how many people we asked. Tattoo allergy means that at some point there is a reaction that happens on the tattoo on one color, and it starts to get swollen. It's infiltrated and it itches a lot. It can be painful and it can be considered as severe because it impacts the patient's quality of life. The second severe complication, I would say, is infection. But yet again, I don't have numbers about that, but it seems that now with professionalization of the tattooist activity and trainings and education of hygiene and asepsis, we see less of these infections on tattoo. So it looks like a tattoo which is inflamed with pus, and it happens very quickly after the tattooing procedure.
About the tattooing inks then, are all types of inks equally problematic?
Red colors or sister colors like pink or violet, most likely because of the red component. They are the ones that really give the tattoo allergies and the tattoo reactions. The reason why it happened in these colors, in the past, it was easy. We knew it was mercury, which was very widely used, and mercury is a very powerful sensitizer. But nowadays, in professional inks that are controlled, we hardly find mercury in it, and there is a threshold that has been fixed by the European Council already more than 10 years ago. However, we still have the reaction. So there is something else now, and we know that there are, for red colors, azo dyes, and we are suspecting a few of them to be responsible of this tattoo reaction, but we are not totally sure why. And we do think currently the trend is to think that the problem is not in the ink, but in the skin. Once it has been put in the skin, there could be modification, the ink pigment changes, and then it becomes more sensitive. That's why people have a tattoo for weeks, months, everything goes fine, and suddenly one day it starts to react. If it was a real allergy, as we understand, like you put the allergen, they should react very quickly, and that's not what we see in practice, or very rarely.
Do you know if it's only some people who react?
You have some people who are most likely predisposed, and the concept will be is very simple because it happened in practice. You have a tattoo, everything goes fine, and let's say that now the component has changed. To get an allergy, you need to be again in contact in another way. So we have people who react after a second tattoo. Suddenly the first start to react because now it cross-reacts. The body sees that there is something new. We have a long time ago, when it was mercury, we had people who have tattoo reaction after getting vaccination because the vaccine contained mercury. And there was also a very nice, it's an exceptional case, but it illustrates well in Japan, was a patient reacted to his tattoo after eating salmon. And they nicely showed that the salmon was most likely rich in mercury at the time. So we have a bit of hint that it works that way. You have to be in contact again with the same allergen, but you also have your own predisposition that you are going to react.
If someone is now experiencing the type of issues with their tattoos that we are discussing here now, what would you advise them to do?
We will treat first the reaction, try to go through it, because we can still treat it even if it's challenging. Of course, the second question they always ask is, can I get a new tattoo? For the color, it's clear that we have to forbid them the same color again. So if they're allergic to red, I tend to forbid red, pink, orange, violet, every color that has a risk to have the same red color inside. Of course, sometimes when I have the ink, I can check on the ink packaging what pigment has been used and try to be a bit more precise and give them one color to avoid. That's a bit tricky because we know also by experience that all the packaging are unfortunately trustworthy. And sometimes there have been studies, especially in Switzerland, that shows nicely that you find sometimes something else that was not on the packaging. So I cannot promise the patient full satisfaction with a new red. I got the stories of one patient who did not listen to me and still redid the tattoo with a different brand but the same red color, and the person reacted on his new on the new tattoo again, just on the right spot of the red color. So it was a nice reproduction of my warning. So I prefer to say, like, choose another color or no more color if you have reacted to red.
What is your opinion about the restriction limiting or banning the use of more than 4,000 hazardous chemicals in tattoo inks and permanent makeup?
This is of course excellent because we don't want to put on the skin things that are forbidden anyway in other indications. That makes sense to me. The also question is, if we forbid something, does it have a relevance in the tattoo as such? Because we know in toxicology that you can have things that are toxic or are problematic in a way that you introduce, but in another way of introduction, it does not pose any problem. What has been always feared by the industry and the tattooist also consequently is that if it happens that in this list of 4,000 there is like a very, very basic ingredient that is like the basic of all the inks, it's like cutting the roots of the tree and we lose everything. And because it was on a list and maybe in the context of tattooing it was not such a problematic. So this is something that was feared by the tattooist and the manufacturer, that could happen. So this is something to be debated, I think, after the law is gone. Can we rethink some of the specific products that are on the list, just see if they are really necessary in this list in the tattooing indication? This is going to be crucial, I think, in the next years.
Do you think that the restriction would have an impact on safety for people who are getting tattoos?
Yeah, it should have an impact anyway, because we still don't know all the reason why people are reacting, for instance, for allergy. We say it's a pigment, but sometimes we wonder if it's not a conservative, a preservative, or something else. So of course it could have an effect, and even us dermatologists work in tattoos, we have discussed that this year we noticed that we had a bit less allergies right now. We had more other complications, like what we call a granulomatous reaction to black tattoos, which are not related to allergy. It's another reaction that is, I think, will be more difficult to get rid of because it's really something that comes from inside, I would say. So we could expect an improvement if the inks are able to follow the REACH procedure. We know also that there are also inks that are available that are not going through REACH, because you can buy them very quickly, very easily on the internet. And it has been also shown nicely this year that there was a difference between the inks that you can buy yourself on some website and the one that you get from the official suppliers. And there is also inks that are clearly counterfeit. They look a brand and they are not, and this is also a problem also, of course. So this ink we could see a difference according to the use of official inks and inks that are not respecting at all REACH.
Thank you, Nicolas, for sharing these insights with us, and Päivi for the interview. Next, we asked the tattoo artists to share their thoughts on this restriction and how they are preparing for the changes it will bring to their business. We are joined by Rebecca from Ale Tattoo in Italy, who talks about the importance of getting support on a national level and cooperation between tattoo artists, ink manufacturing industry, and the EU. What do you expect to be the main benefits of the restriction in terms, in particular, of safety for your customers, but also for the tattooing industry?
The benefits are to reassure the clients and make them understand the difference between past and future. Reassure these clients that the institutions are helping them to make sure that this kind of art is secure for everyone and can last long term.
Do you see any potential challenges in actually putting this restriction into effect? For example, in the availability of safer alternatives for the substances that are banned?
What reassures Ale is the answers that he gains from the producers of ink. They are really working hard to make sure that these inks can work and that can be on the market. Tattoo artists should be able to trust the rules that are imposed by ECHA. It is important to create a big group of tattoo artists so that when there is important information from Europe, this group of tattoo artists can communicate information accurately and in a well manner. To close the circle between ECHA, the European community, and tattoo artists will be very important.
Is there anything else that you would like to highlight?
500,000 people that are working in the ink industry trust you. If we collaborate well together, we will not lose our workplaces. And the 135,000 tattoo studios will not close.
This brings us to the end of our episode. Thank you to our guests and to you for tuning in. If you want to find out more about restricting the inks in tattoo and permanent makeup, visit echa.europa.eu. Liked what you heard? Remember to subscribe to our podcast at echa.europa.eu/podcasts. Safer Chemicals Podcast. Sound science on harmful chemicals.